Emil Cadlick here with FantasyNation.com. We've got a wonderful guest today who started his business in 1991 and was a very influential member of the Fantasy Sports Trade Association and an FSTA Hall of Famer. And he was influential in the fight against the Major League Baseball BAM and NFLPA. So it's going to be a fun time talking to Charlie Wiegart. How you doing today?
Great, Emil. Happy to be with you.
Fantastic. We're going to have fun. Hopefully we get enough tape here for you.
Okay.
Ha ha. Anyway, tell us when you were young, what you were interested in and how it progressed from there.
Well, I was always a sports fan, always a St. Louis Cardinal fan, and my true love had always been baseball, and played Little League and everything like most people do. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough talent that I could play on the field with the other people, so I wound up getting into the sports writing field. When I was in high school, I wrote for the newspaper at high school, and I did a little bit in college, and that was kind of how I got involved in the sports in the beginning. I still remember the days of going down to old Grandin Doty or Busch Stadium to watch the Cardinals play with my dad. So always been a baseball fan. So that was my first love, and how I really got involved with sports was baseball.
So where'd you get your first job?
Well, after I graduated from college, my first job wound up with Shell Oil Company, and I was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And after spending a year up there and the oil industry not doing very well, I got the opportunity to leave and came back to St. Louis, and I wound up with a job working for some newspapers in St. Louis called the Suburban Journals. And I was able to do a little bit of sports writing there and for another little newspaper in town. But my main job at that point was selling newspaper advertising. And basically I did that for about 20 years until we started the fantasy sports business.
So this evolved. When did you start playing fantasy?
Yeah, it was at the newspapers, and it was 1984, and a group of the sports writers there decided they wanted to start a fantasy baseball league. They had gotten a hold of the rotisserie baseball book and realized that it was something that might be fun for them to do as a group, and they thought my being an advertising guy and not being a sports guy would be an easy passy. So they invited me to play inside the league with them, and they probably wish they wouldn't have, because I won the league the first 3 years. And that basically was the start of my addiction to fantasy baseball. The following year, I joined another local league with a bunch of friends, and basically set the league up just like our first one. We named our first league the Mark Littell League after a Cardinal reliever, and named the second league Buddy Schultz League after another Cardinal reliever. So why we picked on them for our names, I'm not quite sure, but we did. And so over the end of the 80s, I was pretty much looking for any fantasy baseball contest I could get into, and really enjoyed the game. It became a great hobby for me. And by the end of the beginning of 1990, I was playing in 8 fantasy baseball leagues at that point. I had played in a couple that weren't necessarily local St. Louis leagues, and actually won a league that a guy out of California was operating. That was a fairly big league and had a fairly big prize. I won a trip to the All-Star game in Anaheim for having won his league. And
so who was that?
That was a lot of fun. So
who was that?
I don't remember the name of the game, but I do remember the trip to the All-Star game, because I had some great experiences there. Got a chance to meet one of my heroes there, Bob Gibson, and it was a lot of fun. Towards the 1990s, I had gotten involved in an aerospace fantasy baseball league with a couple of guys who worked at McDonnell Douglas here in St. Louis, and we had a mutual friend who invited me to play inside this league with them, and they had a hookup with guys at Northrop in California, and that were in the aerospace industry out there, and they had a crazy algorithm that I never did understand, but I knew more about baseball players and what they could do than these guys did. So I went ahead and got in the league and played with them and did fairly well. Won money over the course of the 3 or 4 years playing in that league. And one of the guys in the league, Brian Matthews, approached me about writing coming up with a game that could be done on a national basis. And from all my experience in the other games I played, I had some ideas on something that could work with the salary cap league. And him and his wife were programmers, and were able to program be able to calculate the statistics for large groups of people playing inside the games. And so we decided to take a shot at it, and basically we assigned salaries to all the individual players in Major League Baseball that were playing, and gave everybody a $30 million salary cap to make up a team, basically 28 starters and 12 reserves. And as long as you kept your team within the $30 million salary cap, you could have whatever players you wanted to. So back then, if you wanted Ricky Henderson and Barry Bonds, you could have them on your team, but it meant you were going to carry a bunch of scrubs on your team along with it. We had a unique way of coming up with the salary calculations for the players based on the total production that they had done the previous year and over a 3-year period inside the scoring categories. So we'd look at how many stolen bases a guy had compared to how many stolen bases were in baseball as a whole, and assigned a value to that player based on how many bases that he wound up stealing. And did that for all 5 of the categories, and hitting and 5 categories in pitching. And that basically gave us a good basis for developing the salaries. And of course, they always needed a few little manual adjustments based on injuries and expectations and things, but it worked pretty well for us. And in the beginning, they would start the salary calculations. Our first year, we ran some small blast papers and magazines, and we had 150 people that were playing what we call Carroll's Fantasy Baseball Challenge. And when Brian and Carol would leave to go to work in the morning, they'd start the calculations on the people that were playing. They'd come home at noon and lunchtime and check on it to make sure it was still running. And then by the time they got home at the end of the day, the calculations had finished running, and we were able to print out reports and do mail to people. So now that calculation is done in less than a second, but back then it took 8 to 10 hours for that calculation to calculate only 150 teams. So technology advanced and grew along with it, and they had a lot to do with being able to make things work. But people really enjoyed the game, and the following year we decided we were going to do a basketball game, and John Bryson worked with Brian at McDonnell Douglas, and he was a little bit involved in what we were doing and knew what we were doing, and he tasked him with the challenge of coming up with the basketball calculation program. And so John came in as a partner at that point, and started working with us. So we had 4 partners, and the second year I went over to the Sporting News office here in St. Louis to find our ad, get a copy of our ad that was in their basketball annual magazine. And while I'm sitting in the ad guy's office and paging through the magazine and couldn't find the ad, which they inadvertently left out of their magazine, and an associate that I had known comes walking by from playing in a media league softball league that we had here in St. Louis with the television stations and newspapers and stuff. And so I'd gotten to know people at the other companies through playing softball. And so when he came by, he stopped and said, "What are you doing here?" And I explained to him that we were doing this fantasy baseball game, and I came by to pick up my ad. It was supposed to be in the basketball magazine that they left out. But what I was really looking for was a guy named Bill Topaz, who ran the Sporting News at the time, because we wanted to pitch him an idea on the Sporting News becoming a partner with us on these challenge games we were doing. And he said, "Well, that's my boss." And I said, "I'll set something up for you." So a couple of weeks later, on a Tuesday morning at 7 a.m., the 3 of us were sitting in his office on South Limburg in St. Louis, given the pitch for our fantasy baseball games, and he was kind of half-heartedly paying attention to it and looking at it, and he'd been pitched things like this before in the past. And when he got to the final page and saw what our projection was for the revenue Sport News was going to make on it, he put the paper down and said, "Let's go get a cup of coffee and go through this again." So we did, and went through it a second time, and when we got to the end of it, he said, "Okay, let's do this." And he said, "If we're going to do this, we want to do it in 4 sports that we have annual magazines for: baseball, football, basketball, and hockey." And we said, "No problem," even though we had no games for the other 2 sports. And it was interesting because it was late October when we were doing this, and the deadline for having all the copy in for the fantasy baseball magazine was in about 6 weeks. So we had to get everything prepared and everything to the magazine, and get set up to be able to start handling entries when they would come in and everything, and got it all done. And it wasn't long after we had the baseball going, football came up right around the corner, and we had no football game, and so we thought, well, okay, we got to come up with one. So we kind of mimicked what we do with baseball. And back then, everything was rotisserie style scoring. There really was no point style scoring. So we came up with 10 rotisserie categories for football to be able to have a football game and put it together. And none of us were really following football as probably as hard as we should have. And we discovered after we got the rules and everything out that there was a built-in gotcha in football because of all the bye weeks, which at the time we charged for transactions. So when you change players on and off your starting lineup every week, it cost you a couple bucks. Well, in football, you had a 20-man roster, and you were going to have to change those guys out, put them in your lineup, and take them out of your lineup. So that was 2 transactions that were going to happen for every team and every player that you had, and so that added $10 onto the cost of a guy playing the game with 20 players. So all of a sudden, that was an extra $200 to play the game. So we realized we were going to have to make some kind of adjustments. So we added a Corvette as to the grand prize, and rather than lowering everything. And then the following year, we adjusted what that transaction cost was. But once we already had the rules out there, it was kind of hard to change them too much. And I remember in the early days, one of my moments that was kind of a scary moment. We had everything going to a post office box in Florissant, Missouri, and I would periodically go by the post office box and get the entries out. And this was, in January, February, March, and the magazine came out right at the beginning of the year. It actually came out the last week of December, and so it was like maybe the last week of February, the first week of March, I went by the post office box and opened up the box, and there's nothing inside of it but a little yellow card that said "Come to the counter," and so I got a little bit nervous because back then we weren't 100% sure that fantasy sports weren't considered gambling in a lot of places and things like that, and there was always a big concern about it. And so I thought, oh man, I'm going to walk up to the counter, and next thing you know, I'm going to get arrested or something like that. So, but I thought, oh well, gotta have to find out. So walk up to the counter and hand the guy the yellow card, and he goes, oh, hold on a second. He says, you had too much mail; it wouldn't fit inside your box. I got to get it for you. So he comes back with this great big tub that's full of entries,
Wow.
and at that point, that's when I knew that this thing was probably going to work pretty good. And we had set up a small office in West St. Louis County, and we'd hired one person to work for us, and we were still all working our regular jobs. And after that bucket came in, we realized that this probably wasn't going to last. So Carol was the first one to leave and come into the office and start working again from the office. And the rest of us, we do our regular jobs, and we come in after our regular jobs and be able to handle all the entries and get them put into the system and things like that. I remember being in the office late at night and early hours of the morning, and I remember one time I got a call from somebody that was in Italy that was trying to enter the game. And I asked him, how the heck did you find the game? And he said, well, we were going through New York and I picked up a magazine in an airport and found it, and his English wasn't any better than my Italian. So we had a heck of a time being able to get it all taken care of, but we did. And so we had interesting moments, and my job in advertising sales, required me to be in and out of a lot of businesses and taking their ads in and get the ads corrected and turn them in so that they be printed in the newspaper. And I remember one Tuesday afternoon, I was going through my voicemail at the office, and I had a call from a guy from one of my major accounts, a grandpa's store, that said, hey, nobody's come by to pick up our corrections yet. And I thought, oh heck, I forgot all about it. So I rushed and went to the store, and they were still open. I was able to pick up the corrections and ran to our photo composition plant and had to beg people to be able to make the changes that needed to be made. And that's when I realized that this is going to be hard to continue doing both things. So I decided it was time to retire from the newspaper industry and the advertising industry and start doing the fantasy sports full time. And I know my dad at the time thought I had gone completely crazy and off the deep end. But it all worked out, I guess, didn't it?
Yeah, definitely worked out. So these transactions you talked about back then, did you have a phone line at the outset, or how did they get those transactions to you?
Yeah, we had set up an 800 number at the outset, and for people to be able to call to make transactions, and so most of the entries came in by the mail. A few of them people were able to fax entries in, and we had deadlines, and basically the deadline was always Sunday night, 11 p.m. Central Time, for people to make changes to their baseball team for the upcoming week. So they could only do changes once a week, and it got to a point on Sunday nights that we had four T1 lines coming into our office from the Sprint. That each one could handle 26 calls at a time. So we had the capacity to handle 100 calls at a time in our office, and we had hired all our relatives, my daughter and daughters and their friends from high school and stuff like that, and they were all working in our office, sitting in front of phones as commissioners with headsets on, and people would call on the phone, and they'd have a computer in front of them. They'd call up their team, and they'd tell them what changes they want to make, and they'd make the changes for them and read them back and tell them how much money it cost, and then give them a confirmation number and move on to the next call. And our phones just stayed busy from the time we opened at 10 o'clock in the morning on Sunday until we shut down at 11 o'clock at night. And a lot of times the calls in the queue were waiting over half an hour to be able to get through, to be able to make their changes. And I had a voicemail that it was recorded that people would listen to while they were waiting to make the line. I kind of became semi-famous as the voice, because when I'd answer the phone, somebody would say, "Oh my God, you're the voice, aren't you? You're the guy." I'd say, yeah, but it's really no big deal, And but yeah, towards our peak time in the mid '90s with Sport News Baseball Challenge, we had almost 17,000 people that were playing the game, and so you can imagine 17,000 people trying to call in on a Sunday night to make changes to their teams, and a lot of people realized that they were better off calling on Saturdays than they were on Sunday. So we were busy all day on Saturday also, and a lot on Friday, and the kids made a lot of money, and we took good care of them. They got a good hourly wage, and we gave them a percentage of the transaction revenue they did. So, some of them were making $400 a day, and so for a high school kid on a weekend, back in the mid '90s, to make $800 on 2 days on a weekend. Sitting on the phone, they were thrilled to death to do it, and the ones who were really dedicated to it, they wouldn't get up from their cubicle. They'd sit there from the time they got there until the time they got home, and maybe they'd take one bathroom break, but they'd bring their lunch and have it at their cubicle. They weren't about to leave that cubicle because every phone call meant money to them, so they weren't going to get up and leave. So it was interesting to see how that all worked and how things came together. on the other side of it, it put a little bit of the burden on us to be able to get reports out to people because, no internet. So everything's going out by mail. And so on Monday, we'd have to, we start early Monday morning doing the calculations and getting the results of how the teams were doing. And there were 25 teams in the league and 250 teams in the division, and everybody's competing versus the overall. And so we were printing reports that would show how a guy's individual team did, how he was doing against the other 25 people in his league, all the transactions that were made by the 25 teams in his league on the sheet, how he was doing against the 250 teams in his division, and how he was doing against the 17,000 people he was playing against overall. And so the printing of front and back of 3 sheets and calculating and correlating and stuffing those things in envelopes and mailing them, was a real ordeal. We had a Gestetner that we used for printing that would allow us to do the printing. We had 2 Phillipsburg mailing machines that we used for being able to stuff all the envelopes and everything. And eventually we wound up with an off-site mail center that was 5 minutes from our office where we did all this work because the printing machine and the machine more than anything else made so much racket inside the building we were in that the rest of the tenants were all complaining. So we set up an off-site mailing network, and I remember many a time going by the mail center at 11:30 the mail and load them in my car, my trunk, and my back seat and everything, and make a mad dash. It took about 15, 20 minutes to get to the downtown post office because they were the only one that was still open at that time, and get all the mail crates on their loading docks so that they would get processed and put in the mail stream that night. So people would be able to get the reports in the mail at their house by Thursday. So it was a fun time, an interesting time, and things got a little hairy every now and then, but we always got it done.
So you eventually got a relationship with MSNBC?
Yeah, we had a relationship with the Sporting News in the beginning, and it worked very well. And we had a 5-year contract with them that we originally started with, and we could tell through negotiations with them on continuing that things weren't going very well. They thought that they deserved a little more money out of what was coming through, and after about 5 years, other games were starting up. Sports Buff has started, and there was another game that was in the USA Today at the time. So we were starting to get competition, and we had to adjust prices a little bit, which affected margins and all that. So we weren't making nearly as much money from it. And we tried to explain that to them, but they didn't seem to care or quite get it. And at the same time, about a year before the contract ended, MSNBC approached us about doing games with them. And, our thought process was that our contract with Sporting News was very specific, that it was for rotisserie-style games. And so we came to the conclusion that we could do point-style games for MSNBC and wouldn't be violating the contract. Needless to say, Sporting News didn't necessarily agree with us, and we wound up in a lawsuit with them over it. And which wound up getting settled, and only because the cost of litigation was more than what it would have wound up gaining by going through it. So, but when that wound up happening, we started doing point-style games, and had already started doing the point-style games with MSNBC, and at that point, the internet had come along, and so there was an online presence with the games and things. And the Sporting News decided that they were going to find somebody else to do games, and they found a company called Fanatics Only, who botched up the whole works really bad for them, and in about 3 years they were out of business. And we took our games to USA Today and Sports Weekly, and they'd had a little bit of a bad experience. I think it was Replica Corporation was the company that they were doing games with, and we made them comfortable that wasn't going to happen again. And most of their problems came from trying to have voice adapted systems when people would call in that would go to make the changes for the people on their teams and things, and they never got that recognition working properly. And I think that's why they wound up behind the 8 ball and hadn't wound up shut down. But we were manually using people to do it, so we never had those problems. And so we started a relationship with them, and it turned out to be a really good relationship. And after about 8 or 9 years, everybody was happy, and the games were growing, and everybody's making pretty good money from it. And Gannett decided that they wanted to buy our company, and so we entered negotiations with them, and we were right towards the end. And we were at the end of the year in 2005, and we were trying to dot the I's and cross the T's in the contracts. And one of the things that they were asking for was signed agreements with the Players Association. And even in our sporting news days, we didn't necessarily think that it was necessary to have them, because we knew stats were in the public domain. But the cost for licensing back then was so trivial that it didn't make sense not to just go ahead and do it and keep everybody happy, because the sporting news' relationship with the leagues was more valuable to them than a couple dollars. So we went ahead and did that. So when we got to USA Today, we just continued doing that, and so it was the end of the year in 2005, and I'm trying to get a hold of this guy named John Olshan at the Major League Baseball Players Association, trying to get our contract renewed, and he's stalling me and leading me off, and I couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. And finally he tells me that, okay, well, the Major League Baseball Players Association is selling the players' rights to a new group that Major League Baseball formed called Major League Baseball Advanced Media. And so they're paying us a whole lot of money to own those rights, so you're going to have to get permission from them and an agreement with them, a licensing agreement, so that you can, have a contract with them. So, we get on a plane, fly to New York, meet with the people and all that. And I had a feeling from the beginning when we first met with them that, things weren't going to go real well. And they were a little standoffish. And at that point, we still had the contract going with USA Today, and there was non-disclosures in it and things. So we couldn't disclose to them exactly all what was going on. And we had to make them sign a non-disclosure agreement before we could share information with them. They weren't real happy about doing that, but they did eventually. And they come walking in after they signed a non-disclosure agreement, and the guy says, "What do you think? We don't know what's going on. We know you're selling your company to Gannett, and that doesn't really make us happy, because we're not real thrilled with Gannett either." And he said, "So we'll let you know in about a week or so." So we get back to St. Louis, and we get a conference call, and they inform us on the conference call that no, we're not going to give you a license, and in fact, our intent is to put you out of business. And if you want to turn all your customers over to us, we'll give you a 10% royalty for the first year on what those customers spend, and then after that, you're done. And so we weren't real happy about that scenario and the idea that they were shutting down our business. So we looked at various legal remedies, and hired a law firm in St. Louis called Harness Dickey after interviewing a couple of them. And their lead counsel is a guy named Rudy Telscher, and he had won a similar type case with phone books and people's names in phone books, and so we decided our best course of action was to file a motion against them, a declaratory action, which would enable us to continue to operate our games while the lawsuit was being pursued. And so we had done that, but in the course of doing that, USA Today and Gannett and their lawyers were extremely nervous about the whole situation. And so they said, well, we don't want our name on the games anymore if you're going to be doing this until this lawsuit's decided. So we had to take their name off, and we actually put our company name on it with CDM Fantasy Sports, and our games became known as the CDM Fantasy Sports Games. And it took about a year and a half in legal time for this thing to make it through the channels, but a federal magistrate judge in St. Louis named Mary Ann Medler ruled in our favor. There were four different parts of the lawsuit, and she ruled in our favor in all four of them, and rights of publicity and freedom of speech and copyright laws. And so we were all pretty happy about the fact that we'd won this lawsuit, but we'd taken on some pretty good debt over the course of running the lawsuit and things like that. And fortunately, our customers were very loyal to us and enjoyed playing the game. And our customer counts remained fairly steady and pretty good. We didn't lose very many. At that point, we were operating 6 sports: baseball, football, basketball, hockey, golf, and NASCAR.
Wow.
And we've gotten into golf with the sporting news when the baseball strike happened, and they were worried about the loss of revenue, so they wanted us to come up with another game. And it was either going to be bass fishing because they own Field and Stream magazine, or golf because they own Golf magazine. And I was the only one who wanted to do bass fishing, so we wound up doing golf. And the golf game did fairly well. And so after the strike was over, we continued to operate the game. And so we were operating all those games out of our own name at that point. And after we'd won the lawsuit, Major League Baseball, Advanced Media, and the Players Association were very happy about it, and they couldn't understand how they possibly could have lost this thing. So they decided they were going to appeal and hired a highfalutin law firm out in Washington that wins appeals all the time. And so they come into the Eagleton building here in St. Louis at the federal court for the appeal process. And the 3 appellate court judges just tore those guys up. I had so many smiles on my face that day when they were asking them questions, and so needless to say, they weren't able to get an appeal, and so they appealed after that to what they call the M-Bank, with all the judges in the district, and they turned down the idea of hearing it. So the next appeal that they made was to the United States Supreme Court, and that was kind of one of those situations where, as a lawyer, it's like a dream come true. And one thing every lawyer lives for is the idea that he can argue a case before the United States Supreme Court. But we knew if they agreed to hear the case, that there was always the possibility that they might wind up changing the verdict of it. So when the Supreme Court turned down the idea of hearing the case, we were all pretty happy about it, because that meant that was the end of the court case, and the legal battle was over, and we'd won, and there were no more appeals or anything. And the fantasy industry as a whole, which had been on eggshells for the 2-year period while this thing was all going through, all breathed a collective sigh of relief, because the people in the industry all knew that they were going to be able to continue to operate their games. And I'm sure even companies such as yours that were producing magazines and needed revenue from those fantasy companies for your magazines to stay relevant, it had an impact on you. Plus, you were doing the high-stake games at those times, and it meant you were going to be able to continue to do those games and not have to pay egregious royalties to the players' associations or the leagues, even if they'd allow you to do it. And at the time when this was going down, we'd gotten a feeling from Major League Baseball Advanced Media that they were going to take over all games and operate all games themselves. There weren't going to be any independent people doing it, and maybe an ESPN or somebody who had a real strong relationship with the leagues might have been granted something to be able to operate games, but the royalty they would have paid on would have been really excessive for them to be able to continue to operate those games with them. So it was good that it ended, and if there was one person through that lawsuit that probably came out of this thing who probably made the worst decision of anyone, was the lady who was in charge of the Major League Baseball Players Association, whose name's escaping me now at the top of my head. But after Meddler's ruling, and we had won on the magistrate court level, they had the ability to be able to come to us, and they asked us to ask her to vacate her decision. And while the decision would have always stood, and it always would have been out there, and people have been able to use that to be able to operate games and things like that, it wouldn't enable them, with the larger companies, the ESPNs and the CBS Sports Lines and Yahoos at the time, that they would have been able to still charge them for the royalties and the rights to be able to operate these games, because their relationships with them went so much further beyond just fantasy that they didn't want to risk losing those relationships. So it was probably a multi-million-dollar decision on their part to decide no, that they weren't going to come and ask us to vacate it. And, we were looking for at the time would have been for them to cover our legal fees and enable us to continue to operate our games. But they decided not to do that. And so went through the appeals process and then wound up losing the appeals process. So out of that, they wound up getting nothing. And in addition, I think the Players Association wound up being able to go back to Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball Advanced Media went back to the Players Association and said, hey, you just sold us rights for something that you didn't have control of. So we want all our licensing money back from you that we gave you for this because you were delivering something to us that we couldn't. So she had cost them a whole lot of money and with her arrogant attitude and her not wanting to try to negotiate that. So that's
wow.
The FSCA, the Fantasy Sports Trade Association at the time, needless to say, everybody in the industry realized that we were at a turning point and how important this whole thing was to everybody. And they used a lot of their researches and their funds and hired Glenn Colton's law firm to write an amicus brief in support of the case for us, which you never know if those things helped or they didn't help, but we know for sure it didn't hurt anything.
Yeah, I think the FSTA spent about $40,000 on that, if I recall, and I could be wrong, but that's what I remember for Colton.
Yeah, actually in the end, because they wound up writing two of them, because they had to write a second one on the appeal. Oh. It was 40 to 50,000 that they'd spent on it, which was a lot of money back then for.
Well, that was great that
association like that.
Yeah, that's what the trade association's for, to help. Yeah. And it was such a global issue, and everybody appreciates you. You kind of got stuck having to do it, but obviously you were the guy who was, CDM was leading the way, and I'm glad to see the FSTA, we stood up and I remember that vote. I forget where we were at the time, but I remember at the conference talking about that and voting on it. Another thing real quick, I remember hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was a case against, that the NBA did against, I think it was a cell company who was trying to do real-time data on a phone. And my recollection is that they won. I think this was before your cases. And I recall them saying that the reason they did it was they said as soon as a play is over, the instant a play is over, it's historical data, even if it's during a game. So they were ruled in the favor of the cell phone, not only to be able to put the data up, but put it up during the game as soon as the plays are over, and essentially real-time data. You ever hear about that?
Yeah, and I think Stats Inc. was involved in that in a little bit because they were the one that was supplying the data at the time. And and I remember having conversations with Steve Bird about it, and there were some similarities towards it. But now, as I'm thinking back and thinking of everything that Rudy prepared in the argument for our case, I think he did reference that, but I don't think it wound up being a major part of the decision because of the way that they were doing things compared to the way that we did things. With the use of the cell phones, where we were using the stats, or long after the stats had been finished, but. I think the fact that box scores were in every newspaper in the country and anybody could go into a box score and get the stats out of those newspapers, I think the reality of that had more to do with anything else, and the common sense approach of these things are all available for anybody to use at any time, and the fact that they think that they own these things and can keep anybody from using them or talking about them. When they're in the public domain, no, that's not going to happen. And First Amendment rights were being exposed, the people's right of First Amendment to be able to use those. And I think the critical thing that came out of the case, and I know Rudy had told us afterwards, he said, long after you're gone and buried and 100 years from now, when people are going to remember you for, is going to be this case, because it was the first time First Amendment had been challenged along those lines.
Wow.
And the fact that we won on those First Amendment rights, that forever in the future, anybody that's having a First Amendment case will go back and use the decision from this case and use that to fight on First Amendment rights. So there have been 2 or 3 cases since our case where some of the leagues have decided that they were going to try to go back and enforce something and be able to collect royalties. And I think the Football Players Association went after CBS Sports, and they were pretty smart. They went and hired Rudy, and their lawsuit ended in about 2 weeks. And then there was a case here a few years ago in Indiana that had something to do with college basketball. And the same thing happened there. They went and hired Rudy, and their lawsuit ended in about 2 weeks also. So it's pretty cut and dry that we have the right to be able to use the players' names and their statistics. And the question over being able to use the player's appearance it never was completely resolved because it wasn't part of what we were doing inside of our case. And so if a player's face and his characteristics are in the public domain and people are able to see them and use them from a public domain, then they should be able to use that player's picture also in what they're doing. And so a lot of times when you're looking at making player transactions and they show the player's photo there, and you're wondering how they're able to use this photo, it's because that's in the public domain also. And the First Amendment gives you the right to be able to use that.
And
the magazine business, so
that was done way back in the magazine and newspaper business, and it was stuck in stone. The only exception to that, or one of the exceptions to that, is you can't make an ad that says, Mike Kelly loves CDM Sports. Then an endorsement becomes an issue. So that was scary. That whole thing was a mess. And it was crazy. And, of course, we talked about the trade association. Tell me how you got started in the FSTA, and et cetera.
Well, back in the early 90s, and as we talked before, there was always this concern over if fantasy sports was gambling or not. And there were some little instances going on in Washington and the federal government, and starting to look into it a little bit. And we decided that we probably need to hire some kind of a lobbyist or something to be able to stay on top of what was going on. And so we had a small group of 4 or 5 people we talked to at the time about farming something and doing it. And we were actually paying a lobbyist in Washington, and it was basically just CDM that had been paying them at that point. And talk with some other companies about if they wanted to share in the burden of doing that. And it never advanced too much farther along the line, other than they're being very supportive of it. And then James Serra had a trade conference in Las Vegas at the Flamingo, and a lot of fantasy sport companies were out there as exhibitors. His idea was attracting people who played fantasy sports to come to this conference that he was having to learn more about fantasy sports and to help make them better players and things like that. And so the people who had games and things were there trying to sell the people on the idea of playing their games. And so we all had our little booth set up and we're there. And they didn't generate a whole lot of traffic and didn't get a whole lot of people to come to it. But it did give the 8 or 10 of us that were there the opportunity to spend a lot of time talking and deciding that, it's probably time that we need to form some kind of association. So, to protect ourselves and be able to, handle problems that come up, for everybody in general. And so it was basically out of that we decided that we were going to form the Fantasy Sports Trade Association. And I think that Scott Higgins from EA Sports and Barry Dorff were extremely valuable to us when we were doing that. They had been down these roads before and had an idea what needed to be done, and knew the paperwork that had to be done. They filed all the paperwork in the state of California in order to be able to get us registered and things like that. And I mention that because Scott's gone now, and but we do owe him a great debt of gratitude. And he was quite a character. I mean, we really enjoyed him at the trade association conferences. He'd run around with scissors.
When he was there, it's like, where's Scott? Yeah. It's like, he's somewhere in Vegas.
Yeah, he was a character. We enjoyed having him there, and but it was through his efforts that we were able to actually get things done from a legal standpoint and get registered and things like that. And for the first few years of it, we had a guy named Carl Foster who was running the trade association and helping plan with Greg when we were doing our biannual conferences, and he was kind of running things. I can't remember his company, it was like U.S. Players or something. I know he did a lot of radio work and things like that at the time, and everybody had fees that they were paying and things like that. So there was some money generated, and unfortunately, we never got a real good handle on what happened with all the money that wound up being generated.
You're kidding me.
I don't want to say Carl embezzled it, but he did have a brother-in-law that was doing the accounting work, and they couldn't account for where the money had gone to. So we were at a crossroads that we were going to shut the whole thing down and bankrupt the trade association, or some of us were going to have to step up and take a more active role in running things. And Greg Ambrosia stepped up and decided that he'd take on the responsibility that Carl had of being the voice and of the trade association, president of it, and plan most things. And a few other people, Peter Schenke and Rob Pythian and Rick Wolf, they all took places to be able to help. I agreed to be treasurer and keep track of all the money so nothing funny would happen to it and all that. We were able to operate fairly well, have our conferences and pay our bills and keep our head above water, and everybody got together and we were able to soak away a few dollars. As you know, we spent the money on the amicus brief, but we were able to hire, Ipsos Reid to be able to conduct some research for us, and actually started doing things that were necessary for a trade association to be able to help all its members. And we did a little lobbying and had some legal people. We hired legal people to come in and give us their opinions. We had a variety of different lawyers besides Glenn Colton that used to show up. And, we put on interesting conferences with great speakers and things like that were very helpful to all the people that were in the industry at the time. And we're doing pretty good, and managed to grow the association. And as the industry grew, the trade association grew. And we were able to reach the point where maybe it might have been more time than it should have taken for all of us that were devoting from our own businesses to be able to run these things and run the trade associations. And I remember Goofy Jeff Thomas from Sports Buff. Him and Greg didn't get along real well anyway, and he thought Crosby was making too much money off of our conferences. But without Crosby, we never would have been able to put these things on, because they would piggyback them to another conference that they were doing so we could meet the minimums that the hotels were charging and things like that, and never had to worry about being able to afford having the conferences. But, Jeff decided that we should do it on our own, and he formed a committee and decided that he was going to do one in Chicago, and he did, and it turned out okay, and people attended, and the trade association made a little bit more money for it. So they decided at that time maybe we should hire a director, an executive director, to be able to run things for us, since we didn't have all the time, and people would still participate, but they'd have one person to be the voice. And the first guy we hired was a guy named Justin Cleveland, and he did it for about 2 years or so, and we were able to put on the conferences, and things worked out well. And then he decided he wanted to move on, so we hired a second person. That was Megan Van Patten. And Megan had a background from having run these things before and working with trade associations, and did an excellent job, and took on the conferences. And that's when we really started producing a lot more revenue, and see several sponsorships for the conferences and things like that. And we were able to keep the member dues in line because of it, and still we're putting on first-class conferences and shows. And the association probably doubled in the time while she was the director, and produced a whole lot more revenues. And things worked well until those darn daily games came along, and the daily games kind of changed things a lot for everybody. And and changed and went in a different direction. And I guess the direction it went to was probably a good one, because they're at the point now where not only is it fantasy sports, but it's Fantasy Sports and Gaming Association, and they're attacking the issues that are necessary for the gaming industry, just like the fantasy sports industry faced, when we were going through our early days. So I'm sure it helps the gaming industry to be able to working with people who know what to be doing, and a whole lot more money needs to be spent now on lobbying and getting in front of each of the states and making sure the materials are presented to them properly so they understand what they're doing when they're licensing, and making it affordable so companies can continue to operate. So things have evolved pretty well, and things are moving along pretty good, I think. So
Yeah, great synopsis of the trade association. You were involved for 10 years, all the way to 2017.
Yeah. Yeah, I was treasurer for a long time. But what I really enjoyed doing more than anything else was I became the commissioner of our fantasy baseball and fantasy football leagues. And we, early even from the early days in the beginning when we got together, we had a bunch of guys who were all fantasy geeks, so to speak, just like you and the rest of them. And so we decided that we were going to form our own fantasy leagues and compete against each other. It was kind of
fun.
Kind of a more for bragging rights than anything else in the early days. You had Ron Chandler there and everybody who had any kind of a fantasy baseball tout service or anything, except for Bill James and Benson. We could never get them to play, but we had everybody else playing, and we'd set up to be able to do the draft on one of the nights of the conference, or the night before the conference started. And so we started those drafts in the early 90s, and we were doing the drafts long before it was still the Fantasy Sports Players Association when we started those drafts. Those drafts have been operating for well more than 20 years.
And we have two conferences a year, so we have a baseball draft and then a football draft. And yeah, you just love those things. Those were a lot of fun. I played in many of them way back when.
Yeah.
And they were so much fun. The trade association's got so many memories. I don't mean to interrupt.
And, out of that kind of came unexpectedly. It kind of become something that really helped the trade association become more of a name in the industry, and people get to know it, because Sirius XM Radio approached us about being able to broadcast live these drafts that we were doing on the radio, and had some of their people work as announcers, and in addition to picks going down, make analysis of them and things like that. And so we agreed to start doing that with them. And so next thing you knew, we're on Sirius XM All Sports Radio doing these drafts, and we were getting a lot of plugs before it wound up happening, as the draft's going to happen. And as the dates wound up happening, they always wind up being the first draft of the season. So the baseball drafts are in January when the baseball season has started. The football drafts are in June before football was just starting. So they've kind of become known as the first drafts of the expert drafts of the season. And they're like a mainstay now. And all those drafts are on the radio. And I think that helped establish the Fantasy Sports Trade Association as a vital entity and a real part of the industry, getting the recognition of having the radio station broadcasting those things. And as it evolved, in addition to broadcasting the drafts that we were doing, they also got into some of the other social issues and things that were being discussed at the trade association, at the industry as a whole we're dealing with. And I think that helped raise public awareness of the things that are happening and going on in the fantasy industry and some of the challenges that we face, and made the public maybe a little more sympathetic towards us.
Yeah, it's really great. Sirius stepped up. It was a great win-win. So now you ended up selling to CDM to Fun Technology?
Right. After the lawsuit, and we'd built up a considerable debt, and Fun Technologies came along, and they at the time had already bought Fanball, Rob Pythian and Paul Charchian's company, and we're planning on buying a few other companies and building a large fantasy company. And they approached us, and we were interested, needless to say, because of the debt, and we're able to negotiate and work a deal with them on their purchasing us and merging us with Fanball together into one company. And at the time when that went down, I think Fun Technologies was maybe 49% owned by Liberty Media Corporation, so they were already involved at that point. And within 6 months of our transaction, Liberty Media Corporation had bought out the entire company from Fun Technologies. So we all became employees of Liberty Media Corporation, and we were working for them, and they merged us with some other Liberty Media companies that they had in hopes of building a bigger company. And easy for me to say now looking back on it, but their decision as to which division that they wanted to put us into probably wasn't the best one for us or for the fantasy industry, because we could have gotten merged with the DirecTV branch, which would have had a great opportunity to really make things take off really fast. But they put us in a different division, and eventually the other things that were going inside of that division failed, and they weren't making money, and it wasn't very successful. And Liberty decided they were going to shut our division down. And while our games were still doing well, and we still had people playing, and we were still making money on our end of it, the whole division wasn't. So myself and an ex-partner and a couple other people decided we would buy our original games that we started with back from them. And at that point, we'd had draft and play games that we were doing also. So we bought all those games back, and formed our own company, CDM Fantasy Sports, to continue to operate the games that we'd been operating for 15 years up to that point. And so we continued to run those games and operate them for about 5 or 6 years out of an office here in St. Louis. And the daily games came along and started to take a little bit of bite out of our business, and we did lose some of our customer base to the daily games. And our customers were still playing our games, but the guys were playing maybe 4 and 5 entries, cut back to maybe 1 or 2 entries, and started playing daily games. And there was also a whole lot of other competition in the industry at that point for people playing games, and the draft style games became the more prevalent way for people who want to play games than salary cap games. So, we could kind of see the writing on the wall, and we're going through the hassles at the time with credit card transaction processing, and the New York governor came down against FanDuel and DraftKings, and we had trouble trying to explain to them that these season-long games are different than these daily games, and we had some really interesting board meetings back then with the FSCA over how they were handling it all, and so the opportunity came for us to be able to sell the company again, and the Sports Hub Technologies, and so we decided it was the right decision to do that, and John Bryce and Henry Iyer continued to work for the Sports Hub Technologies, basically operating the games the way they continued to. And I worked for them for a couple of years as a consultant, and on a full-time basis. And now it's they don't necessarily need my help as much anymore. So the only consulting I do for them anymore is on an hourly basis, working on the salary cap games and still coming up with the salaries for the players that I guess I've done since the early 90s, and I still enjoy doing that. And I write an article every week for RT Sports when the sports are going on, the baseball one and the football one, advice from the Godfather. And I keep my finger in a little bit. I applied and became an independent governor for the Pennsylvania Gaming Commission, which is something required for all companies that want a license in the state of Pennsylvania to be able to operate fantasy or gaming companies. So I'm available to be hired by companies to be an independent governor for them if they're looking for one in Pennsylvania.
Wow.
But other than that, I spent a lot of time gardening, which I've always done over the years. We've always talked about my fun doing the gardening. So I do that.
That's coming up here.
Yeah. I got my plants in the greenhouse cooking right now. I got about 500 tomato plants out there that are all popped up and growing. So
you're way ahead of me.
What I'm going to do with them, I'm not quite sure, but I'm getting ready. And I spend a lot of time in Masonic work. I'm real involved in the Masonic lodges and the shrine, and so I continue to do that. And it's charitable thing that I feel good doing, and actually visited a lodge in Santa Fe when I was down in your area here last year after Thanksgiving.
Wow.
So yeah, I enjoy doing it, and it's my way of being able to give back a little bit. So it's kind of fun. Right now we're not doing anything because like everybody, nobody's having any meetings or doing anything. But
we're all
this coronavirus will go away here at some point when things will get back to normal.
Yes. Well, Charlie, you've truly had a fantastic career, and you're truly a fantasy sports pioneer. Congratulations for your great career.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it, and it's been enjoyable. And I've managed to do okay at it. I put a couple girls through college, and I'm hanging in there and still doing okay. So no complaints.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much for the time. And congratulations again.
Okay, well, I appreciate it.